Hey family, this year's a special year for America. On November 21st, 2019, it will mark the 400th anniversary of when Mayflower dropped anchor at Cape Cod. And the last time I talked about our Mayflower ancestors, I mentioned having 13 direct line ancestor grandparents who were passengers on the Mayflower. Actually, I was mistaken. The number is 12, not 13. But since then, I've found a few more, and now the number is even higher. Every time I make a Mayflower connection, it's like having one of those jackpot moments. Anyway, in this video, I'd like to talk about my Smith and Ruth Mayflower connections in our family tree here. So here's the path to finding our Mayflower ancestors on the Smith side of the family tree. Here's my mom, Nancy, and my dad, Robert. And if we go back, we will find my third great-grandparents who are Lot Smith and his second wife, Jane Walker. It is by way of Jane where we come to our Lydia Cook. And if we pull up the generations after Lydia, we begin to find our Mayflower ancestors. And I've noticed when you get around this point, or this generation in the family tree, and if one of these people is going to be related to a Mayflower ancestor or early American settler, you will start to see a lot of hints or records show up for these people here. The reason so many records might show up in this area is because for 4 or 5 generations following the Pilgrim's Landing, a ton of research has been done already on these early colonists and their descendants. So if you make it to this point and start to see or run into a lot of records attached to these people, you can start to get excited because it's an easy task to connect further back in history toward these early American colonists and possibly Mayflower pilgrims. And some might question how we have so many Mayflower ancestors. And the reason for this is because the community of people living in Plymouth is so small. Therefore, because this gene pool is so small, it is not unusual at all that if you're connected to one Mayflower pilgrim, you may be connected to many other Mayflower pilgrims as well. And this is evidenced by these ancestors in this generation here. They are connected to a lot of Mayflower pilgrims. So moving on, here we have Francis Cook. In the year 1619, just about 400 years ago, he was a passenger on the Mayflower, and for me, he is my 10th great-grandfather. He sailed on the Mayflower with one of his sons. This son's name was John. A couple of years later, in 1623, his wife Hester LeMahieu and 4 other children came to Plymouth. They sailed over on a ship called the Anne. And Jacob here, my 9th great-grandfather, was his other son that came to Plymouth on that ship. Hester LeMahieu was of French Walloon stock and a French Protestant. She migrated with her family to Leiden, Holland. It was in Leiden where in 1603 she met and married Francis Cook, who was a woolcomber by trade. In Plymouth, Francis kept a bit of a low profile, but was a member in good standing in Plymouth. He served on quite a few committees and such for the Plymouth colony. And he received some land grants from the Plymouth colony and remained in Plymouth his entire life. Francis had 7 children together with Hester, but one of the children died young. Francis was around 80 years old when in 1663 he passed away. His wife Hester passed away a few years later in 1666. Okay, moving down, here we have Stephen Hopkins and his wife Elizabeth, and they sailed over on a Mayflower with 3 children, a Constance and a Giles from his first wife Mary, who had died, and Damaris from his wife Elizabeth here. Elizabeth also gave birth to a boy named Oceanus while on the Mayflower. One of their children on the Mayflower, the 2-year-old Damaris, I always get her mixed up with this Damaris here. This is where I thought we had 13 Mayflower ancestors instead of 12. Anyway, this daughter of Stephen and Elizabeth Hopkins, also named Damaris, was the second Damaris, as their first child, Damaris, had died. This second Damaris was born in Plymouth in 1627. I've seen this several times in my genealogy research where a child had died, and after having another child, they would give the new child the same name as the one who had previously died. Okay, now getting back to Stephen Hopkins here. He was a very interesting man and was a big help in establishing the Plymouth colony, especially when it came to Indian relationships. Stephen was the only Mayflower pilgrim who had sailed to the New World previously. Because of this, he had some experience with dealing with Indians. Years before the Mayflower, he was on another ship bound for the Jamestown colony in present-day Virginia. This ship was called the Sea Venture. On this voyage, they got caught up in a great storm and became shipwrecked in Bermuda. And Bermuda is located quite a ways out in the Atlantic. Anyway, over the next 10-month period, the crew took the wreckage of the Sea Venture and cobbled together another ship and then sailed it to Jamestown, which is about 650 miles away as the crow flies, but a far greater distance when you consider they had to tack and jibe their way to get there. So here we have Stephen surviving being shipwrecked, surviving 10 months in Bermuda, and then surviving the tragedies of Jamestown. After some time in Jamestown, he managed to return to England. In England, Stephen found his children, but his wife Mary had died. Stephen then remarries and heads off to the New World again. Out of all the Mayflower passengers, it is Stephen Hopkins alone that has first-hand knowledge of the hazards that lay ahead. For him to undertake such an adventure, this time with family in tow, I find pretty remarkable. There's too much to properly cover Stephen Hopkins' life here, but you can find out more about him online. There's even a book written about him called Here Shall I Die Ashore, and there's also a William Shakespeare play called The Tempest. It was said to be inspired from the shipwrecked castaways of Stephen Hopkins and the crew in Bermuda. But if you're like me, as with most of Shakespeare's works, you'll be hard-pressed to make heads or tails out of The Tempest. In this very abstract fantasy play, the character of Stefano is said to be the one who represents Stephen Hopkins, in a very unflattering way, I believe. Moving on, down here we have Mary Chilton, and here is Mary's parents, James and Mrs. Chilton. James Chilton died on December 8, 1619, shortly after the Mayflower had dropped anchor at Cape Cod. At 64, James was the oldest member on board the Mayflower. And a very short time after James's death, during that first winter, Mary's mother also died. Death was not uncommon to the Mayflower passengers, as close to half the Mayflower's 102 passengers died that first winter. It's interesting that only 5 of the 18 adult women survived that first winter. Another one died a few months later, leaving only 4 adult women out of the 18. Why is this percentage of death so high for the adult women? I think it was out of love. These hero women ended up paying the ultimate sacrifice. They lived and worked on the Mayflower as nurses with diseased individuals in cramped, filthy, cold, and damp environments. I'm thinking it was out of love that these women kept their children away from these diseased areas. Their children were their priority. These mothers tried to keep them as dry, fed, clean, and comfortable as possible in an impossible environment. In so doing, they subjected themselves to all manner of exposure, exhaustion, and neglect. We have to remember that during this first winter, for months, the women and children were confined to the Mayflower. During this time, the men were living on shore, building up their fort and dwellings, and were working on many other tasks as well. During these winter months, where the women and children were living on the Mayflower, it was basically a floating icebox of a hulk, filled with disease and death. So the death of her mom left 13-year-old Mary an orphan in the New World. Finally, in spring, the women and children were allowed to come ashore and move into their fort. Mary is traditionally honored as being the first female to set foot on the shores of New Plymouth. Her stepping onto Plymouth Rock signifies the ushering in of family colonies from England into North America. And Mary did well for herself in life. Because she was the daughter of James and Mrs. Chilton, she was due land, and at the age of 16 received her division of land. This land, as with land these days, was pretty important. She went on to marry a well-to-do merchant named John Winslow. John's brother was Edward Winslow, and Edward was also a passenger on the Mayflower and a prominent figure in colonial American history. Mary and John lived for much of their lives in Plymouth, but later on they moved to Boston and settled down there, and they were prominent and wealthy citizens in the Boston area. Mary died in 1679, and her husband John's tomb is located in downtown Boston at the King's Chapel burial grounds. Okay, on this branch of the tree for Simeon Holmes, we will find William and Mary Brewster. They came over with their two youngest boys, Love and Wrestling. They came over on the Mayflower, and another son and ancestor grandfather, Jonathan Brewster here, came over on a ship called the Fortune in 1621, a year after the Mayflower. Now, William Brewster was the spiritual leader of the Pilgrims and a very important part of the Mayflower colony. He is most likely the person who actually put pen to paper and wrote out the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is said to be used as a foundation for the writing of the United States Constitution. When in England, William was a leader in the separatist movement, and his family fled England to escape religious persecution from the Church of England. He and his family fled to Leiden, Holland. In Leiden, he ran a printing press and published articles criticizing King James I and the Church of England. The king wanted William Brewster brought to justice and had the Dutch authorities searching for him. At this time, William became a fugitive and went into hiding. He was later smuggled aboard the Mayflower for their voyage to the New World. We don't know a whole lot about William's wife, Mary. We don't even know her maiden name for sure. Some thought it was Wentworth for decades, but now other possible maiden names have surfaced, but none of these names were found conclusive. William and Mary had 6 children, some with pretty interesting names. Well, here's Jonathan, but they also had a Patience and a Fear and an unnamed child who had died young. And then there's Love and Wrestling, who sailed with them on the Mayflower. Mary died in Plymouth in 1627 and was about 67 years old at the time. Okay, back off of Mercy Weston's branch here, we have the Mullins family. Here's William and Alice Mullins, and they came over with their daughter Priscilla and a son named Joseph. Back in England, William was a shoemaker. He even brought 250 pairs of shoes and 13 pairs of boots with him on the Mayflower. But William, Alice, and Joseph all died that first winter. As with Mary Chilton, this left Priscilla an orphan in the New World. Priscilla was 17 or 18 when orphaned. Now, I talked about how 4 of the 18 adult women lost their lives that first year and the sacrifice that they made. Because so many adult women died, the children, along with Priscilla Mullins and Mary Chilton, had to take over the countless tasks and responsibilities that now fell to their shoulders. With Priscilla being the oldest of the children, I imagine the responsibilities that fell to her were even greater than most. In 1622 or 1623, Priscilla married a crew member of the Mayflower. His name was John Alden. He was given the choice to sail back to England or stay with the Pilgrims. I can imagine that Priscilla Mullins may have played a big role in John's decision to stay with the Pilgrims. Priscilla was given considerable land grants owed to her through her parents' death. These grants gave Priscilla and John a good foundation to build upon. They went on to raise 10 children. Now, John Alden here was a cooper or barrel maker by trade, and his carpentry skills probably came in pretty handy in the building up of Plymouth. The famous poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a long narrative poem about Priscilla, John Alden, and Miles Standish. This story of a love triangle between the three is thought to be mostly fiction, but Longfellow claims it is based on truths passed down to him through his family history. Anyway, John Alden was well respected and held key positions in Plymouth. In 1629, John Alden, Miles Standish, and several other Plymouth colonists founded Duxbury, which is located just north of Plymouth. Throughout his life, he was a prominent and upstanding citizen of Duxbury and held several different positions. However, most of these positions were unpaid. Later in life, he petitioned for and received several land grants from the Plymouth colony. John was able to distribute these lands among his children. He died in 1687 and was one of the last surviving members of the Mayflower. His Duxbury home that he built in 1651 still stands today. As a side note, I find it interesting that one of John and Priscilla's children, who was also named John, was almost hanged as a witch. John Alden Jr. was accused of being a witch in Salem, Massachusetts during the Salem witch trials period. After 4 months in jail in Salem, he was able to escape and fled to New York to avoid a trial and possible hanging. This was a dark episode in American history where a mass hysteria enveloped the town. 15 women and 5 men were executed, most by hanging. One person, a male, was crushed, or what they call pressed, by having stones laid upon him, and several others died in prison. Okay, back to our tree, and back to the branch of Ebenezer Adams here. Oh boy, here we find the Billington family, and they sailed over with all 4 members of the family: the father, John, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 sons, John, 16, and Francis, 14. All 4 of the Billingtons survived the first winter. The Billingtons were pretty much the bad boys of the Plymouth colony, if you will. And I'm including the father in that. But anyway, the first recorded instance of mischief was while the Mayflower was anchored out at Cape Cod. 14-year-old Francis here took his father's musket and fired it off inside a cabin. If that wasn't bad enough, there was an open keg of gunpowder sitting out. Now, these muskets would easily shoot off sparks clear across the cabin. Not only would the sparks fly out of the barrel end of the gun, but there would be a big flash of spark back by the trigger end where the powder was touched off. I'm not sure how many other kegs of gunpowder were in the cabin or on what deck Francis was on, but what if the incident happened inside a lower cabin where all the gunpowder kegs were stored? If a spark did land on an open keg, the ensuing explosion would have set off all the other kegs, and the whole Mayflower story might have had a different ending. It would be a little more than a simple line in a footnote of history reading something like, "A ship called the Mayflower was lost at sea, no survivors." I don't know. Okay, another incident involved Billington's other son, John. We'll call him John the Younger. John had wandered off and got lost for many days. He ended up being taken in by the Nasset Indians. This was the same tribe that attacked the Pilgrims shortly after they had landed. The colonists had to gather together a group of 10 armed men, find him, and negotiate his release. John was rescued after being missing for about a month. I'm guessing these 10 searchers were not real happy about going out and fetching this Billington kid. They had nothing better to do than roam around the wilderness looking for him. Lucky for everyone, the Nasset tribe was in a giving mood that day. Okay, back to our grandfather Francis. He even discovered a shortcut to the Pacific Ocean. He was out exploring to the west of Plymouth. He climbed a tree and spotted a great body of water, and he thought it was a great sea. He came back and reported what he saw to the leaders. Some of the leaders may have thought Francis discovered a direct route to Asia, but it turns out that it was just a large pond that Francis had discovered. To this day, this body of water is called Billington Sea. Okay, Father John Billington seemed to be the antagonist of the Plymouth colony, always seemed to be undermining or complaining about Plymouth's governing body and the church. John was never part of the separatist movement, and it is probably safe to assume that he resented the church and those in authority in the Plymouth colony, and the feelings of the Plymouth church about John were equally resentful, I'm sure. One time, John was even implicated in a serious plot to overthrow the Plymouth church, but denied his involvement and was never punished for lack of evidence. Later on, John was involved in an ongoing argument with a colonist named John Newcomb, or Newcomen. John Billington was convicted of shooting and killing him. In 1630, John Billington was tried and hanged for his crime. This hanging was the first ever execution to take place in Plymouth. John Billington was the first New England settler to be convicted and executed for murder. And interesting enough, John Billington is not the only one in our family tree that was convicted for murder. This other case of murder also took place in Plymouth some years later in 1654, 1655. And this case is much more disturbing than this case of John Billington. But I'll save that story for another time. So in short, yes, we have witches and murderers in our family, if you can believe it. Eleanor Billington was one of the only 4 adult women to survive that first year. Eleanor was not without issues either. In 1636, she was accused of slander against a John Doane and was sentenced to sit in the stocks and be whipped. And back to Frances here. Frances settled down and married Christian Penn Eaton. She was the 3rd wife and widow of Mayflower passenger Francis Eaton. Frances Billington and Christian had 9 children together, and it was in the same year of 1684 when both Frances and Christian passed away. Okay, that's the 15 direct line ancestors to the Mayflower passengers on the Smith side of the family. Let me close these trees down and back out of here. But we're not through yet, because what's exciting here is that I found another Mayflower ancestor, this time on the Ruth side of the family tree. So let's go this way from the Ruths over to the Hydes, and here we'll go down to Mary Throop and onto the ancestors here, and finally we come to Richard Warren. Richard Warren was about 35 when he sailed over on the Mayflower. Richard came over alone, leaving behind his wife Elizabeth and 5 daughters, a Mary, an Anne, a Sarah, an Elizabeth, and Abigail. His wife and daughter sailed over on the ship Anne in 1623. Warren went on to have 2 more children together. This time they would be boys, and they were named Nathaniel and Joseph. All of his children went on to have large families, and it's for this reason that Richard Warren is one of the most common of the Mayflower passengers to be descended from. In this tree we hail from his daughter Elizabeth. Richard died in 1628. We don't know a whole lot about Richard Warren other than he was a man of good standing and station. Richard and Elizabeth, along with all his children, received land and cattle shares from the Plymouth colony. In 1669, a book by Nathaniel Morton entitled New England's Memorial, he referred to Richard as a useful instrument when he wrote of his life. Oh, there is one caveat regarding Richard Warren. In this tree, when we get to Mary Throop here, the LDS ancestry site called FamilySearch.com shows a Mary Ames married to a Joshua Barker, not Mary Throop. So which Mary is the one married to Joshua Barker? Throop or Ames? But it's interesting to know that both Marys are descendants of Mayflower passengers. Mary Throop to Richard Warren, as my tree shows, and Mary Ames is also descended from a Mayflower passenger by the name of Edward Doty here. So either way, we're covered that way. But I'm fairly certain that the family search tree has the wrong Mary in this spot here. I say this because all the other ancestry sites, and there's a bunch, that I've seen show the wife of Joshua Barker to be Mary Throop, not Mary Ames. Also, the documents and records I've seen support that Mary Throop is the wife of Joshua Barker. But if there's anyone out there who wants to go to FamilySearch.com and try to straighten out this tree and make it correct, good luck. I tried, but I got in over my head real quick and ended up restoring it back to the old incorrect tree, I guess you'd say. So there it is, 16 direct line Mayflower ancestors from both my mom's Ruth side of the family and my dad's Smith side of the family. And stay tuned, I'm not sure, but there might even be more. I say this because I haven't taken all our family tree lines back to the point of their immigration to the Americas yet. And again, if any of you want to browse around this tree, just send me an email at slsmith7632@yahoo.com saying, hey man, can you send me a link to the tree? And I'll send you back the ancestry.com link so you can check out this tree here. There's a ton of family history stories and other interesting information found in the gallery sections of our ancestors within this tree. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody, and have a great year in this quarter centenary of our forefathers and mothers landing in America. See ya.